Sir Charles, the round mound of Rebound. Charles Barkley was one of the dominant greats of the game. He was a perennial all-star in the late 80s and up to the late 90s, and although some of us, like myself, remember Charles for all of his greatness on the basketball court, many young NBA fans best know Chuck as a hilarious TV personality. He's currently working as an NBA analyst for Turner Sports and is always sure to provide raw and straight shooting opinions. With his fame crossing over into the world of NBA analysis, I think many have forgotten or just have never known how great of an NBA legend Charles Barkley actually was. Today, we're delving into the career of one of my favorite players from my childhood, and hopefully, we leave this video with a greater respect for one of the greatest to ever play. Charles Barkley was somewhat of an astonishing anomaly of the NBA. He was an undersized power forward, standing at only 6 foot 6 inches tall, yet he still dominated the position with his quickness, physicality, and punishing build. Despite the fact that Sir Charles was only 6'6", he still dominated the boards and solidified his legacy as one of the greatest rebounders in NBA history, averaging 11.7 boards per game over the course of his career. Charles was one of the most efficient scorers in NBA history as well, which is quite a remarkable achievement, especially when you consider the fact that he was usually a few inches shorter than the power forward who was guarding him. Despite his lack of length, Charles still often scored at will, as he averaged 22.1 points per game over the course of his career and is currently 26th all-time on the NBA's all-time scoring list. The most incredible part about Chuck's scoring ability wasn't simply just the scoring, but the manner in which he scored his points. Like I mentioned, Charles was an unbelievably efficient scorer, as he shot an incredible 54.1% for his career. So just how efficient is that? Well, out of the top 50 scorers on the all-time list, he's the most efficient non-center from the field in NBA history at 54.1%. If you include centers, he was third behind Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was 7'2" and had the most indefensible shot in NBA history, and behind his fellow analyst Shaquille O'Neal, who basically spent his entire career simply dunking the basketball. Sure, Chuck did his fair share of dunking as well, but he also did a lot of damage throughout his career from mid-range and even occasionally from three-point range. Charles' dominance didn't just affect the NBA in terms of wins and losses, but his dominance actually changed the way the game is played. Thanks to Chuck's ability to use his strength and back down the opponent, the NBA created the back-to-the-basket rule. Now, for any player located below the free throw line, he could no longer back down a player with his back to the basket for as long as 5 seconds, which was something Charles did decently often in his games before the rule was put into effect. Despite his world-class scoring, rebounding, efficiency, and the ways he changed the game, Charles was still unable to claim that elusive NBA championship. When you add all of this up, you have a legitimate argument for the title of NBA's greatest player of all time to never win a championship. Obviously, guys like Karl Malone, John Stockton, Allen Iverson, and Elgin Baylor have their own case for that title, but if you ask me, that title belongs to Sir Charles. I'll take the guy who was an all-around baller, who was an unstoppable scorer, a dominant rebounder, was a terrific passer for a power forward, he could run the fast break, and was the epitome of efficiency. Sure, Charles won only one MVP award in his career, and that was in the 1992-93 season, and although that season was impressive, that award was far more of an acknowledgement of his team's success that year because that season wasn't even one of the best seasons of his career. These are the impressive numbers from his 92-93 season, where he led his Phoenix Suns to a 62-20 season and eventually a trip to the NBA Finals. Although these MVP stats are incredibly impressive, when you compare them to the numbers from his previous seasons, you begin to see how Charles could have been winning MVP awards year after year during his prime. Notice particularly his remarkable efficiency compared to his MVP season. During Barkley's prime, he was shooting just about 60% from the field every year. That is unheard of, especially of a player of his size. One final thing I want to address to really emphasize the greatness of Charles Barkley and explain why he was as great as he was, yet didn't have all the championship success that many other greats had. When Charles was in his prime, he never played beside a legitimate superstar. When he had just begun to break out as an NBA superstar, his teammate Julius Erving was in his late 30s and was nowhere close to the superstar he once was. By the time Charles Barkley actually played with a legitimate superstar in Hakeem Olajuwon, Charles was in his mid-30s and in the twilight of his career. At that point, Charles was averaging under 20 points per game and under 50% field goal percentage. Again, during Barkley's prime, he played with good role players and all-stars like Kevin Johnson, Dan Marley, and Maurice Cheeks, but never did he play with a legitimate franchise player, which brings me to my next point. Listen, I love you, Shaq, but you need to stop heckling Charles for his lack of rings compared to your championship rings. You had a young Kobe Bryant who coincided nicely with the prime of your career. Kobe was an electrifying young superstar who could score at will and was also a lockdown defensive player. In 2 of Shaq's championships with the Lakers, Kobe was averaging near 30 points per game, 6 rebounds, and 6 assists, while being a lockdown defender and a clutch performer. No offense to you, Shaq, but you have this guy in Kobe Bryant who could win you Game 4 of the NBA Finals when you fouled out. Tell me, who's supposed to do that for Charles in the '93 Finals against Jordan's Bulls? Kevin Johnson or Dan Marley isn't taking over a game like Kobe Bryant can. What about Shaq's lone championship with Miami? Shaq wasn't even the best player on that team. It took a clutch series from Dwayne Wade where he literally carried his team on his back, averaging 34.7 points, 7.8 rebounds, 3.8 assists, and 2.7 steals in a dominating effort to beat the Mavericks in the '06 Finals. What if Barkley had that kind of support in the '93 Finals, or just in his playoff runs in general? What about Charles' competition at his own position? Karl Malone and Charles Barkley were often compared to one another for the title of best power forward in the NBA, and honestly, I always liked Charles in that argument, but unfortunately, Chuck didn't have the luxury of having arguably the greatest facilitator of all time as his point guard for just about his entire career. Listen, I loved Kevin Johnson of the Suns and Maurice Cheeks of the 76ers, but neither of them were John freaking Stockton. Charles Barkley was an absolute all-time great player, but he just didn't have the luxury of playing alongside other superstars while he was in his prime, like other greats have throughout the years. If that had been a luxury that Charles had been blessed with, you bet he would have the rings to show for it. Let me know in the comments section where Sir Charles ranks on your list among the greatest power forwards in NBA history. Thanks again for watching this video, guys. Make sure to like and subscribe for more NBA content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.